Welcome to the Trailblazer Talks podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Hope Jones. This podcast is designed to encourage and equip you to be a trailblazer right where you are, to help you discover your God-given purpose and bring you talks each week that will inspire you to do what you were made for. So let's get into this week's episode. Hey friends, I am so excited to share this week's episode with you. I interview a guest on the show named Linzie Hermsmeyer, and I'm so excited about this episode because we just had a wonderful conversation to help former athletes and just anyone who is trying to figure out their next step in life. It's a great conversation all about taking next steps in life and kind of figuring out where we hold our identity. And Linzie, as a coach, she helps ambitious women who are former athletes, who are in their 30s, who are trying to figure out their next step and become purposeful leaders and thriving entrepreneurs. And she helps them both professionally and personally. And this episode is packed full of wisdom, and I just loved my conversation with Linzie. So I can't wait for you to take a listen and share it with another former athlete that you may know, and share it with someone that you think could really benefit from this episode. But without further ado, let's hop into this week's episode. Hey friends, welcome back to the Trailblazer Talks podcast. I am excited because we have an amazing guest this week named Linzie, and she does so many awesome things with coaching. And if you are a former athlete, this episode is for you. But Linzie, thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited to have you on. Tell our audience just a little bit about who you are, what you do, and just a little bit about your background.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Courtney. I've been excited to have a conversation with you and hopefully provide some, just aha breakthrough moments for your audience too. So really excited about that. Yeah. So a little bit of background, a former college athlete with a background in basketball and rodeo. And fun fact, I grew up on a ranch. So, fixing fence and all the things. It's just a fun part of my story where that's a lot of like where hard work and the grit that I talk about was developed. And so, yeah, graduated from college and had a little bit of, transition in there where it was like, hey, what's next? And I think so many people, whether you play sports or not, like you're a competitive woman who, you poured into having those good grades, or, you poured into meeting this goal, and all of a sudden this goal, it's accomplished, or you've moved on. And so, I hope that really resonates with your audience, that there's that transition time. And so for me, there was that time. And so in that transition, had to find, okay, what does God want for me next? And so, long story short, found coaching, and it has been a blast to get to help former female athletes and just competitive women in general to find that purpose again, and to really, to take life from feeling meh, like feel like I'm meant for more, but I don't know what that is. Taking them from that to getting, that purpose driven, that competitive edge back, and that grit that they have inside them, and just really channeling that in the ways that is most meaningful for them.
Yeah, I love that. I have a sweet spot for former athletes too, because my husband is a former athlete and he's currently a college golf coach. He's an assistant coach for men's and women's golf. And so we are around student athletes and former athletes all the time. So definitely whenever you had reached out to me about being on the show, I was like, yes, this is perfect, because we have a lot of listeners who are in college and who are currently athletes, and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do next. But tell me a little bit more about that journey for you of transitioning from kind of that active athlete to becoming an entrepreneur, and kind of more about that story that you were just mentioning, and what advice you would maybe give to current athletes, student athletes, people who maybe they know that's not their forever thing, but they aren't sure what's quite next.
Yeah. I like that you say they know that that's not their forever thing, which is awesome to have that in mind. Because I don't think as, athletes or college students, it sometimes maybe feels like, not that it's not good to be in the moment and really focus in on what we need to do at that time. But, I think we can be way too in the moment and not think about our future, or like, so for example, our identity, putting our identity in what we're doing as an athlete, and not thinking, okay, someday I'm not going to have the title of an athlete. And so just looking ahead into that. And so I would say, one of the things that I like to encourage current athletes with and former athletes with, is not putting our identity in our performance and what we're doing as an athlete. For example, it was my sophomore year of college, and it was a really tough season, and I'm thankful for it now. And it was just kind of like some things got taken away from me, as far as I was playing basketball at the time. And so that was a rough season with basketball. And then I actually had a friend group that learned, okay, these are actually not solid people to be around, and had turned out, they were kind of lying to me about some things. And so we're just keeping some things covered up. And it was like, just again, a tough season. But in that season, the Lord revealed to me that I was putting my identity in who I was spending time with and how well I was performing in my sport. And so, it was just, I remember I was, where I was and what I was thinking. And it was just like, man, Lord, like, you have my whole heart now. Like, I grew up in a Christian home, but it wasn't until my sophomore year of college that it was like, all right, he's got my life, my whole heart. And obviously, like, as a young kid, asked him into my life, but that heart transformation wasn't there until college. And so thankful for that rough season, now. But, and it's just a continual thing of not putting my identity in what I'm doing, and more so of who God has called me to be and who God made me to be. So transferring now to entrepreneurship, there's that time from college to what's next. And I found that I did need to have that like next thing to go after, because God created us for purpose. And I know you talk about that a lot too, Courtney, is just like, if we're not living on purpose with intentionality, it's just, what are we going for? And that's when depression, anxiety, like all those things can creep in. And so just finding that time of like, okay, what am I going to go after now? And on a superficial level, for me, that was actually running. After sports, it was like, what do I do now? And so that was my time to push myself in running. And I was pushing myself physically, but then also, learning my thoughts and what I'm thinking about matters so much. And so whatever season it is, whether it's sports or entrepreneurship, it can be so easy to put our identity in maybe how well our businesses are doing. And we feel like that's a direct reflection of our self-worth. And so, just keeping the aspect of, this is kingdom minded. So my husband and I, we run an auto detailing business together. And you wouldn't think that, cleaning vehicles can be a kingdom mindset kind of thing, or building the kingdom, but it totally is. And so just keeping in mind those conversations that we're having and all of those things. And so keeping the main thing is what I encourage.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think anything can be a kingdom opportunity, because basically, I mean, we weren't called to just be in the church and that's where we only talk about God. Like, we were commissioned to go out into the world and spread the gospel. And so I love that intersection of what we call like sacred and secular, because we need Christians out in the marketplace and out in their own businesses where they get those opportunities to share about God, and to, even if it's not a direct like, hey, do you follow Jesus? But like, they may notice something different about you and your business.
Yes.
Like, hey, they're really nice. They're like really kind people. There's just this light about them. So I love that. And you kind of touched on this with talking about where you were rooting your identity. What kind of like practical things helped you with that kind of identity shift? Because I know so many athletes, and not even just athletes, but so many people, like you mentioned, do put their identity in their job, in their sport, in their major at school, or whatever activity that they do. Like, I know so many people, it's like if that gets taken away, they're like, who am I? Like, what do I do? Like, I know my husband went through that in high school a little bit, where he was playing golf and he injured his back and had to get back surgery, and he wasn't able to play golf for a little bit. And he kind of wondered, like, am I ever going to play golf again? And thankfully he was able to, but that was kind of like a wake up call for him of like, oh, I can't put all my eggs in this basket. And he was going to a youth group and stuff too. And so he kind of was able to figure that out. But I know so many athletes, and I see this too, even in professional sports where they retire and they're like, I don't know what to do. So what kind of like practical things would you say kind of can help us with making sure we're rooted in the right things and not letting the things we love kind of become our whole identity so that we can find kind of that calling that God has for us after that current thing we're doing?
Yeah. First of all, real quick, Courtney, something popped into my mind while you were talking, and it's kind of related, but also I just, when things pop into my mind, it's like I feel like it needs to be shared. But one of the things too, like that we can, as you're talking about identity, caring so much about what other people think about us. So I guess this does it does go along with your question in the sense of like, I think when we're transitioning from the athlete to then career, there's so much of like, well, what are people thinking of me now? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was this athlete and I was seen as this person who could perform and do well and excel. And then when we start this new thing, it's like we might be really bad at it at first, or that, that failure that we feel like we're experiencing. And I think so many times as entrepreneurs, or you're starting a new career, what we think other people are thinking of us has a huge impact on what we place our identity in. And so a quote that I would tell myself is like, what other people think of me is none of my business. And so it's so straightforward that I loved it so much, because it was like whenever I got into that mindset of like, well, I'm starting this new coaching business or whatever I was doing at the time, it was like, well, what are these people thinking? And we all know that we can go down a cycle that's just not beneficial. It's not purpose driven, and it doesn't help us get to that next thing that God has called us to. And so just thinking of, what other people are thinking of me is none of my business. What God is thinking of me, and I mean, he always delights in us. I think that is, as we're transitioning to a new thing, keeping that in mind is huge. My friend is so good at reminding me, he always delights in us, whether we're thinking like, man, I feel like he's, God's looking at me just kind of like, well, she did it again, like she can't get things figured out. And it's like, no, he always delights in us. And so just keeping those things in mind is so, so big, and just keeping in mind what God has for us and really seeking out those truths, what's real and true in those seasons when we don't know what to do next, and just seeking out what the Lord has for us.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm glad that
Yeah.
that popped into your mind because
Yeah.
that is a huge part of where we root our identity is if we do have that fear of man, so to speak, and we are
Mm-hmm.
constantly worried about what other people think. And that's something I've overcome many times over and over
Yeah.
again through different seasons of life. It's like I'll feel like I overcame it and then I'll enter a new season of life and it kind of is like another layer peels back. And it has hindered me at times from walking fully in the things that I felt God was calling me to. Cause I was like, what is so and so going to think if I post this? Or what are people thinking? But yeah, and I would love to know too, like, are there any other things with rooting your identity that were helpful for you, like things that you did that kind
Mm.
of made that like click a little bit more that maybe those students or even just anybody could kind of implement if they are having their identity currently in the thing they're doing?
Yeah. So, just from personal experience, there was a time when this was a while ago. I was putting my identity so much in what I was doing that it had created, like, I'd gotten to the point of an anxiety attack. And
Mm-hmm.
so, the first anxiety attack, it was just like, okay, like something's gotta change. And, what came from that is like, okay, I need to shift what I'm thinking about, but also what I'm putting in my mind. And so when it comes to identity, what we are consuming will impact that tremendously. And we hear that a lot. What we consume, eventually it comes out. So, but that's so huge for that is, maybe preparing for the workforce, or they're in that time of transition. It's what are we consuming in that transition is so huge. And so after that experience, it was like, all right, something has to change. And as I was changing things, my thoughts still like, I still spiraled into almost another anxiety attack. But the thing that changed for me was, instead of putting my identity in, those thoughts that I thought were real, I got up out of bed and started reading. And that is something that it's hard to do in the moment sometimes, but yes, just really reading what was real and true helped me to, regain my thoughts in the right place and put my identity in the right places. And two, I work with, and maybe we'll talk about this later in the podcast, but my grit framework is it's very practical way for former athletes or those who are super competitive and they don't know what to do next. That is a great way to transition and, have our identity in the right place.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'd love to learn more about that and kind of like what does it mean to have grit and how can we kind of have more mental toughness? Because I feel like that's something that I've noticed a lot with my generation as a millennial with Gen Z is we in some ways like we've had a lot of great improvements with like being more empathetic and getting to, really understand mental health and stuff. But on the other side of it, I feel like in a lot of ways we've lost kind of mental toughness. And we notice that in college students now too. And it's not to pick on them, it's just to say, hey, like there's an area that we can improve on and like how do we grow in that. So I'd love to know like kind of more about that grit method and just what it means to have grit and what it means to have like how we can have more mental toughness to help us, because ultimately that helps us in life to be able to cope and be able to handle hard things and be able to move forward as we grow up, because as we know, life is not always rainbows and butterflies and easy, and we have to have that grit and mental toughness when those hard times come. So love to hear your
Yes.
thoughts on kind of how you develop that framework, what it means to have grit and mental toughness.
Yeah, great question. How I developed grit was totally the Lord. It was just like, I was praying about it, and I believe that we all need those coaches, those guides in our lives, just like when we were on a team or in the class, like we had that coach there, and all of a sudden we might not, or we had that accountability and then we don't. And so as I was praying about what my coaching program and all those things, grit just kept coming to mind. And so I was like, okay, Lord, we'll use grit. And so and that word, it just means so much, as far as like that resilience and that that drive to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And so yeah, where I start out with is the G stands for growth. And so growth isn't just about what we achieve, it's about who we're becoming in the process. And it can become so much, I think through society, it's like, well, I got to achieve, have success, all of these things. But really, it's like, are we just going through life, or are we actually growing through these different, these hard seasons, these challenging times, or the good times, like when we experience these wins and these results that we're looking for? Are we growing? And so that's why I love to have growth in there, and resilience, the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficult times. And it is that toughness that you were talking about too. So that's the R in grit. And it's not just about physical toughness, it's the mental, the emotional strength to overcome career or, personal, just those mindset obstacles that we have. I remember a time when I was in high school, and it's hard to explain kind of like the point system in rodeo, but you want to place at least the top 10. And, I kept placing fifth right in the middle. And it was just like so irritating to me. I was like, what is happening? Like, I got to get over this hump. And so my dad encouraged me, he was like, not that we don't want to improve and get better, but he's like, just keep going at it. Just keep that resilience and just keep pushing. And so, he's like, you're in a great spot. And so really fun that year, I ended up making it to nationals. And it was like, just that, those moments when we're like, well, it's not going well, so I might as well just, give up or whatever that is. It's like, no, that resilience, we need to keep pushing through. And so, and then the I in grit is intention. So this is probably one of my favorite things, because if we're not living with intentionality, one year after the next is just going to look the same. And we won't improve. We won't keep those priorities or those values that we have. We won't keep them where they should be. And so it's just an attitude of purposefulness with a commitment to deliberate action. And so, as athletes, we practiced with intention every day. We got those reps in. And so that's also where it's like we're transferring that athletic mindset, that competitive mindset now into the real world in our home life and work. Is how am I being intentional so that I can actually move forward in life? And then the T is tenacity. So the quality or fact of being very determined. It's interesting because according to Forbes, tenacity is a fierce blend between determination and persistence and grit. And so for leaders and their organizations, and I know you talk about this too, Courtney, leadership. So for leaders, it is an attribute that can mean the difference between failure and success and can take a team from doing all right to thriving. And so I love that about tenacity. And so yeah, with my grit framework, I take my clients through the 90-day program that I offer through, mastermind. So we're getting that group aspect, that team that we used to have, and that accountability, and then one-on-one coaching as well. And so many other things along with this 90-day program, but just really helping transfer that competitive edge that they had and now transferring it into real life in that way.
No, I think that's awesome. And I love the breakdown of grit because I think all those things are so important in helping us grow. And it's funny when you talk about rodeo, my only experience with it is watching the show Heartland. And so that's like what I picture whenever you talk about like
Yeah.
horses and rodeo and everything. 'Cause I love that show.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. So what would you say are some like harmful mindsets that might kind of hinder that growth? Like things that we can kind of be on the lookout for that might be like hindering our growth or like kind of just harming our mindsets to like achieve that grit and that growth?
All or nothing thinking, or that perfectionism. Because, like I'm currently working with a client, she's incredibly driven and it's amazing. And so, but I mean, she just experienced aha moments a few weeks ago that it was like, no, I don't have to do everything perfectly. And if I think, through some coaching that we did, it was that fact that I wish I could remember exactly what I said, but it's like, how would it feel to just do a little bit? Like we don't have to do it all, and then we can keep moving forward, because otherwise it's a little or it's nothing. And so, for that competitive woman, it can feel so much like, well, I gotta just go hard, get it all done. And it's like, yes, that's awesome to have that grit, but also we need that, that grace in there, that intentionality where it's like, okay, we can't, we're human. If we didn't have limitations, we would be God. And that is not, I always like to remind clients of that too. It's just like, our friends or family, that when we're being so hard on ourselves for not accomplishing what we think we should, that's probably a point where we're thinking, I don't have any limitations. Why is this so hard for me? And so just a good reminder of like, we are human and we need those limitations in our lives to help us recognize what is truly important and meaningful and what we should actually be going towards. So yeah, I think that that's definitely a big one as far as a mental block that we can experience.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful because I think it can be that all or nothing mindset sometimes just with the like competitiveness of the
Yeah.
world. And so I love that. And you talk a
Yeah.
lot about self leadership as well. And I would love for you to like kind of talk a little bit more about that and how we can start to implement that in our lives too to help us grow.
Yeah. I used to think that when I heard leadership, it was like, yeah, well, I'm not a leader. What are we talking about here? And, through college or even after, it was like the aspect of self-leadership is that we're the intentionality to lead ourselves every day so that we can serve others better. And that's a huge part of my why. Is why am I, getting up in the mornings to have a morning routine that I get excited about? Why am I doing that? Well, it's so that I'm leading myself first. Then I can help lead others better and serve them better and all of the things, I talk a lot about that, a morning routine. And it's impacted my life a lot. And so that's why I like to encourage that. Before I had a morning routine, I was kind of a grumpy wife in the evenings because I was like, that former athlete that was like, oh, I didn't get my workout in, or like I
Mhm.
didn't spend any time with the Lord, or I didn't learn anything, about him today. And so transferring that to, okay, I'm doing that first thing in the morning And then the rest of the day just felt like, okay, I got done what I needed to. And so, yeah, that's what I always encourage too.
Yeah. And kind of along that same line of thinking, what about like accountability, and what are some ways that we can maybe grow in accountability in our lives to kind of achieve some of those goals? Like what helped you with kind of being like, okay, we're gonna get this morning routine down and we're
Yeah.
gonna, do these things. What ways were you accountable to yourself, and kind of how can we grow in accountability? Like whether it is, saying to like our husband or our significant other, like, hey, I need to do this routine. Like, can you keep me accountable to it? Or what would you
Mm,
recommend, like, for accountability?
yeah. So a few things come to mind, and we're building evidence for ourselves that we have this um that we have, what word am I looking for? Like this consistency. Because if we tell ourselves we're not a disciplined person, then we're probably not going to be a disciplined person. So, it's building that evidence that, okay, I am a consistent person, I am disciplined. And so, but I built that evidence with an accountability partner. And I love that you bring this up because I was definitely feeling convicted about, like, okay, you're kind of grumpy in the evenings. Like, you've been wanting to start this for a while. And the Lord was just like, go for it. And so anyway, I reached out to a friend, and it was like, hey, I've been wanting to start this. Let's want to do this together. And it was so fun because that's what helped launch me into the consistency and building that evidence that I can do this. And so becoming that disciplined person again. Funny part is too that I encourage with accountability partners is sometimes it can be like, well, I have this plan to do 10 things in the morning. It's like, who wants to get up and do that many things right away in the morning? And so we actually challenged each other to do less. And starting small with the simple stuff. So, I encourage start with one or two things in the morning that you really want to do, whether that's journaling or a workout. What's realistic? What do you actually want to get up for? And so that was so helpful. We actually used kind of a tracking app. Again, it built evidence that, like, okay, we can do this, and we could both see what we were accomplishing. We check in with each other, and that was a great way to launch us into that, moving forward to create a day where we could feel energized and ready. And so that's where I like to work with my clients as well, is how are we starting our day so that we can have that grit throughout the day and that energy that we need to succeed.
Yeah, no, I think that's so awesome. And it really does help having accountability, because I feel like when we try to do things on our own, we can only sustain it by ourselves for so long. And it kind of reminds me of that scripture in the Bible where Moses is like holding his hands up, and he is like trying to like keep the kind of war at bay, so to speak. And then Aaron and Hur come alongside and hold his arms up because he starts to like grow
Mm-hmm.
weak by himself. And so I think that's a perfect picture of what accountability can look like.
So
But
good.
something that I love to ask our guests, since this is called the Trailblazer Talks, is what is that one piece of advice that you would leave with the listeners of something that God
Mm,
has taught you kind of along your own God given trail?
yeah. I think something recently during my morning routine, it was like God was just saying very clear to me that consistency looks different in different seasons of life. And because, yeah, that all or nothing thinking, or that frustration that can come in, or that overwhelm, whatever it is, consistency can look different in different seasons of life. And my husband and I are going through a very different season. We're expecting our first baby and building businesses, and I'm getting to coach these incredible women. And, it can be easy to yeah, it's just like that looks different in this season of life. And then something that followed that I feel like God just dropped into my mind was asking ourselves, what do we need to be consistent in before we can be consistent in the thing we want to be consistent in? So, there's that building block of, again, building evidence. We're starting small with the simple stuff, and then we can build off of that. And so instead of, having this thing of, I want to be consistent in this like really huge thing, it's where, what do we need to be consistent in first? And maybe that starts with hitting snooze once instead of twice. And so I just loved that. What do we need to be consistent in before we can be consistent in the thing we want to be. And so, yeah, that's just kind of what I've been learning lately and trying to adapt into my life and encouraging others with as well.
Yeah, no, I love that
Mm-hmm.
last quote that you said. It was so good because I think so often we do try to do too much at once and then we overload ourselves and then we don't do anything. But
Yeah.
I love that. And also, congratulations on expecting your first baby.
Thank
That's so
you.
exciting.
Thanks.
Okay, so the last question I like to ask before we can like connect on how people can find you and stuff is what's something that you've been enjoying lately or has brought you joy, like something fun you're loving right now?
Yeah. Yeah, I think initially preparing for baby, but then also, in this season, we found out we were expecting, and 2 weeks later, we had to move out of our home due to health
Gosh.
concerns. There was some remediation that needed done on our home, and
Mm,
that was kind of scary. We rent, and so things were just like it was. We had to definitely give up control, the comfort that we wanted, especially during this time of like finding out, hey, we're gonna have a baby, and we had to move out for 3 months, which but during that time, like, it doesn't seem like I'm answering your question right now, but during that time, like, my husband and I still got to, we leaning on the Lord and then also just learning more about our marriage and each other and building businesses at the same time. And um the amount of community that stepped into through church family and our friends and family, it was just incredible. So now we're back in our home and we can start preparing for baby, and there's that like expect that joyful expectation, that kind of comes in with that. But just getting to strategize with my husband has brought a lot of joy to my life too, and getting to move forward in what God has called us in.
I love that. No, that's awesome. And it is stressful whenever you have a lot going on at once
Yeah.
and you're like, "Oh my gosh, like what are we doing? What's next?" So, I think that's amazing you guys were able to like grow through that.
Mm,
But I would love for the listeners to be able to connect with you and
yeah.
for you just to tell them how they can connect with you, anything else you would like to leave them with today, and where they can find you.
Yeah, yeah. They can find me on Instagram, Linzie Hermsmeyer, and I would love to connect on there. If they want to DM me, we can start a conversation that way. But also, yeah, you can find me on lindsayslifecoaching.com. Or as I said too, the easiest way to kind of learn more about, the morning routine that I talk about and learn more about me and transition into that potential free consult that I offer is they can download my free guide for making every day a success with this morning routine. And so they can find that on lindsaylifecoaching.com as well.
Yeah, and I'll link all
Yeah.
of that in the show notes too. So if you're
Awesome.
listening, make sure you head to the show notes and find all the resources that Lindsay has. But thank you so much for all your wisdom and just pouring into us today. This was
Mm,
so awesome and helpful. And I know it's going to help so many athletes who are wanting to transition into something else after they're finished with their athletics. So thank you.
yeah. Yeah, thanks, Courtney. I appreciate this. And I really do hope that, what was said can be really some aha moments for the audience. And I just appreciate what you're doing as well. Like you're pouring into others, and it's incredible. So thanks for having me. I'm honored.